In this lesson we're going to create our cheese shader. So we're going to apply the shader to these cheese chunks here. Click on this to create a region so we go nice and quickly, and I'm just going to region that and maybe zoom in a little bit. Okay, and then I'm going to assign a shader, so select the cheese cubes group here. I'm in the rendering menu, just going to go to lighting and shading, assign new material, and then go to shader, and we want AI skin. So AI skin, not the standard, we want the AI skin. Okay, so this shader is a special shader, and it's basically calculates subsurface scattering. So let me just press play here, and you can see that it looks a little bit like skin. Let's look at some of these attributes. So whenever you apply shader, I would just try and build it up one step at a time. So let me just go and turn this weight off here, this first section, subsurface scattering. Let me just turn that off. So I'm just going to change the weight to 0. And now you can see what's left, which is just the highlights. So that's the specular. So inside the specular, you've got a weight of 0.8 and a roughness of 0.5. So that means it's a glossy reflection. So if you change this to 0, for example, you'd get a nice mirror look. Or if you change this all the way to 1, you're going to get a more diffuse highlight. Okay, so I think 0.5 is pretty good for cheese. Depends on the cheese, but it is a little bit shiny. So I'm just going to turn that down for now so we can tune the other aspects of our shader. So I'm just going to actually, before I turn that down, let me just show you what IOR does, index of refraction. And just like the glass shader here, if we were to turn this up, watch this stuff, you're going to see that it has less of a Fresnel effect. So in other words, the faces facing away from us are reflective, but also the faces facing towards us are reflective as well. So they've got a bit of a shine to them. Okay, so if you wanted more highlights facing you, then you could change that. I'm just going to leave it on the default for now. Okay, and let's just change this specular weight to 0 for now. There is another layer of specular here called sheen layer, and that's because it's for skin. It allows you to have 2 different layers of specular, one for the sort of highlights you see on the edge of your face, so on the glancing angle of your face, and one for a more tight specular highlight. So that's why it's got 2 layers here. These are the same parameters, but you can have different IORs for these and different weights. Okay, so we're not going to be using this in this particular cheese layer. If we just turn it on, it's just the same thing. It's basically just got a roughness and an IOR. So I'll just turn that down. Incidentally, this is where you would put your specular map if you had one. So let's go up to SSS. It's a pretty simple shader. It's got 3 layers of subsurface scattering, and subsurface scattering will basically take a ray and scatter it through the material depending on the radius. So the radius here is a multiplier, and what you do, let's just change this to 1, is to change this, and it's going to multiply the radii on all these different sections. So we've got 3 layers of scattering, and we've got 3 different colors. So you've got shallow, and you've got a weight for that, and a radius. You've got mid scatter, and then you've got deep scatter. Okay, and you can see it's a different radius there. This is slightly deeper, and then this is slightly deeper as well. So basically, it's going to come in and it's going to go through the material, so you'll actually see light going through. So the bigger this number is here, the more you'll see it goes through the material. Okay. So what we're going to do, the default was 1 there. Okay, so let me just turn these down one at a time just so you can see what they're set to. So I'm just going to remember what these weights are just so I know. So it's 0.5, 0.25 and 1. So I'm just going to change these to 0. And then you can see the contribution that they have. So if I change this to 1, you can see that's what the deep scatter looks like. And then we've got 0.25, and let's just change this to 0. You can see that's what that looks like. And then we've got 0.5. Okay, and that's almost like the top layer. Okay, so you can imagine this as kind of a gradient, and the colors that you want should be kind of matching in a gradient here. So we're just going to put in some yellow colors for the cheese here, and we're going to increase the radius. So we're just going to increase this to maybe 2. So we get a little bit more light passing through. And then what we'll do is we're going to change these colors. So I'm just going to change this one. This first one, the shallow scatter, it has the most effect on the look of the cheese. So let's go to here, and we're going to saturate this a bit. Okay, and then we'll change this one to a bit more orange. So I just changed the saturation there. Let's change the weight back up to 0.25, excuse me. And then let's move down to this red here. Change the weight back up to 0.5 or 1. And let's make this slightly less red. So just make it slightly orange. Bring the weight down a little bit. And this middle one, I'm just going to want it to be a bit more orange, so I'm just going to change the weight up a little bit. And let's just change the overall weight down a bit. There we go. Okay. Right, so now what I'm going to do is turn the reflections on. So just to reiterate what we did, this is the overall weight. We've turned that down a little bit so it adjusts all of them. We've turned the radius up so we get a bit more subsurface scattering. So if we were to change this to 1, this is the default. And if we didn't have any radius, you can see this is what it would look like with a regular shader. Not very interesting. So let's just change this back up here. Okay, so I'm going to move my way down. So we've changed the color of these, and I've changed the weight of that as well. So if we go down to specular, let's turn this back on to 0.5, so we get a little bit of highlight there. Okay, so now we've got a little bit of highlight. Just maybe increase that a bit, and maybe increase this a little bit as well. Okay, so now we've got a little bit of highlight on our cheese there. If you can't see what you're doing and you want to see this a bit better, you can just temporarily turn this weight down. So we've got it on 0.58, so I'm just going to change that to 0, just so you can see the contribution that you're having, so you can see what that reflection looks like. Another way of doing that is actually using what's called an AOV. So AOV is an arbitrary output value, and that means that basically, during this shading calculation, Arnold is calculating different aspects of the render, just like these sections here. So we've got SSS, specular, sheen. So what we can do is we can output those as a separate image, and it doesn't really cost that much to render because Arnold has already calculated it. It's only going to put that into a texture. So let's just enable a couple of these just so we can see it up here. So all we do is just go to the render settings, AOVs, and then we come down to the shader that we've used. So we've used an AI skin shader, and it gives us the available AOVs for that shader. Okay, so AI standard has got more. AI skin has got these AOVs that we can use. So let's just add the SSS, the specular, and then we'll just have a look at it. So now you can just change it to specular, and now you can see what your specular looks like. Pretty handy. This is the subsurface scattering, and then this is everything together. Okay, so there we go. Now you may notice that this is very grainy, and this is because this is using a different type of ray. So if I just change this to real size here, so if we just go to render settings, this is a good opportunity to show you these rays here and how the different rays affect this. So the shading that's going into this particular shader, this AI skin shader, is going to be the SSS rays. Okay, so not just the SSS rays, obviously, but the stuff that you're seeing through this material is the SSS rays. So if I were to increase the number of rays here, you should see grain disappear here. So normally you don't want to increase individual sliders unless you really need to, because you want to increase the overall camera AA and then see if there's anything else that's outstanding, and then you can increase that accordingly. But I'm just going to increase this just to show you here. So if I just increase this a bit, you can see it's going to take a little bit longer to render. And it's going to be nice and smooth. There we go. So that looks nice. So I'm just going to change that back to 2 for now. Okay, just so it can work a little bit quicker. You can see it is a bit slower. So the other thing I'm going to do is just give this a subtle noise on the specular. Now you could do this in the color as well if you wanted to, but I'm just going to show you how to do that, and then if you want to, you can add noise to the yellow colors if you wanted to as well. So let's select one of these guys and go to the skin shader, and we'll go to specular, and we're going to map this with a procedural texture. So we'll go click in here, and we're going to use an Arnold one. So we can use these 3D textures as well, and if we had painted a texture, we could just add a texture if we wanted to, but I'm going to just show you this texture, this AI noise texture, which is a procedural texture from Arnold. So if I click on that, it's basically a 3D texture. So you can set the scale here using these 3 numbers here. So let's just see what that does. I can show you a nice feature of Arnold render view here, which is basically you can isolate whatever texture you've selected. You can see that by itself, so you can see the effect it's having. So if I were to go to this debug menu here and say isolate selected, now because I'm selecting this node, I can see the pattern that I'm selecting. Okay, so if we wanted to scale this up, for example, we can say 2. So you can see it's a little bit more frequent. You could increase things like the octaves so you get more detail. Okay, and then the distortion. Okay, I just want slightly bigger patterns. I'm just going to leave it something like that. Okay, and then you've got the coordinate space here as well. If you set it to world space, it would swim through this material. So in other words, if I moved these objects, the texture would stay the same, but we want it on object, so it sticks to the material, so it sticks to the object. Okay, so let's have a look at what that looks like on our actual shading. Okay, and I'm just going to look at the specular. So you can see it's just broken up there. Let me just turn up these settings a little bit just so you can see this a bit better when we have a look at it in the final render. So let's just change this to 4. So it's a better quality. And you can see there's less subsurface scattering there. So we can turn up the amount that we had. So I'll just select the shader and just change the weight up a little bit. So this is specular. Just change the weight up a little bit. Okay, so now it's a bit more noticeable. And if I change this to specular, you can see that specular there. Maybe just change the weight up a little bit there. Yeah, I think I can overblow that a little bit with amplitude of 2. If I do select and change this to isolate selected, you can see what that does is just give it a bit more contrast. So if you change this amplitude to 2, it's a bit more contrasty, which looks a bit better, I think, and a bit more noticeable. Okay, so in this lesson we set up our cheese shader using the AI skin shader. We also had a look at AOVs and using them for diagnostics. And then we also use the isolate selected feature in the render view and the AI noise texture to break up the specular.